Hello, everyone. I think we'll just take another minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. Okay, thank you for coming. My name is Laura Rangel, and I'm assistant professor here in cognitive science. I'm here with Taylor Scott, who I'll let introduce himself in a second, and Emily Winokur, who's a graduate student. Taylor, you want to say a few words?
Sure. Hi. Welcome, everybody. Good to see so many folks showed up. Yeah, I'm an assistant teaching professor in the department. Been with the department for 4 years now, and definitely have gotten to spend a lot of time getting to know students that are preparing to go into graduate school or apply for jobs. And it's always a really rewarding experience to get to talk with folks about their plans for the future and help them really, hopefully realize what they want to do and how to get there. So
Emily?
Sure. I'm Emily. I'm a fifth year PhD student in the cognitive science department. And over the past few years, I've worked for the STARS program during the summer, and I always lead the personal statement writing workshop. And I've worked with many students and read through their statements and helped them rephrase things, how to talk about their research, and make their statement better. I've also put together a guide on writing personal statements that may or may not have been distributed. And I really enjoy sharing advice about writing them and how to talk about yourself.
Yes, Emily did prepare a guide. We'll try to get that out to people after this. So I imagine that now is an excellent time to start thinking about personal statements, as some people may be heading on to new things upon their graduation. And that might not necessarily be graduate school. It might be that you're applying for a job and you're trying to put your best foot forward in a small, single paper cover letter. And so one of the things we want to do is answer your questions. So, as they come up, please go ahead and put them in the chat. But I think, there's some basic advice that might be helpful about the process of writing a personal statement, right? And, what might go into the content and how you might leverage some of the things that are very particular to you to write something very personal, right? So, what should we talk about first? Should we talk about the actual process of writing a personal statement, or should we talk a little bit about the content? What do you guys think?
I would actually vote to start with a little piece of advice about process, because I actually think it's a really good framing device. And I think it sets a good expectation for sort of what the process will be like, and also then thinking about how you will continue to incorporate content. And it's something it's something that I always am very adamant with folks that I talk to about preparing these types of statements for any of these the variety of reasons that Laura said, is that be prepared to revise. You're not going to get it right the first time, and almost without fail. I mean, there certainly is a point you can come to where you're starting to over revise, but for the most part, there's not really any such thing as too much revision. And I think that people can really be surprised. I'm always real surprised, even to this day, when I go look at a first draft of something compared to where it ended up, and just how much it can improve with each revision. And I think if you go into it with the mindset that, you don't expect to nail it the first time, and know that sort of build it into your timeline and you're thinking about how you're going to build that statement out, is that it's going to go through some revisions, and that it's going to get better as you keep going. And I think that's a really good framing device to have in mind.
And I guess maybe following up on that, one of the reasons it'll go through so many revisions is you should probably be sending it to lots of people for feedback. And that's so hard when you're writing a personal statement and someone has comments about something not quite making sense or not fitting. You're like, what do you mean? This is me we're talking about, right? And it's hard to edit something that you feel you put your heart and soul into, but you will definitely have to get other people to read it so that you can see whether or not you got the message that you wanted to get across actually across to your reader, right? Sorry, I think Emily was going to say something right before I started.
Oh, it's okay. I was saying that I wanted to add, like, don't stress too much about the first draft because it's like so early. And my advice is usually to like just try to get your thoughts out. And once your thoughts are out, don't worry about the length. It's much easier to like cut back and revise once you've said everything you could possibly say to then cut it back later. So the first draft can be daunting, but it goes through so many revisions that don't let it stress you out too much.
Yeah, I definitely 1000% agree with that. I always think of the first draft as I'm not trying to build the house. I'm just trying to get as much raw material on the page to build the house from that I possibly can. Like I try not to do any sort of like preemptive editing as I'm writing that first draft, and just, even if I'm going to cut an entire paragraph, even if I completely decide to obliterate half a page, it doesn't, just get it out there and don't do too much self-editing on that first pass. I think that's great advice, Emily.
Also, on the topic of first drafts and like deleting a whole paragraph, one thing I also suggest is having a separate document that I call like a parking lot. And I do this whenever I'm writing anything, where if I write a paragraph and it's like, this doesn't really belong here, but I don't want to delete it forever, I move it to that parking lot. So later, if I want to use it, I have it there to use. So I would suggest not deleting anything.
It's all great advice for writing in general, actually. Both of your comments. So, what are your thoughts about the process still? Do you want to talk a little bit more about content, or do you want to talk a little bit more about going through the writing process itself?
I do want to sort of, and maybe this can help bridge the gap between the two, is I want to just reiterate something that Laura said, which is about showing it to a lot of people. This is something that I think is both very important in terms of getting a broad variety of feedback and commentary, but also it's always helpful, I think, to understand that different people are going to see you through a different lens and a different light. And sometimes they're going to see some things you maybe didn't think about or you didn't see, in terms of both like I remember back when I was writing personal statements for grad school that I showed it to some folks, and they brought up some really interesting things that hadn't even occurred to me to include. They're like, hey, didn't you tell me that one time about this, this thing you did? And I feel like that would go really well right here. Like it would really tie nicely into this other section, or it would really help highlight how you have a passion for this and how that actually manifested in a very personal way. And so I think, don't just show it to your peers. Don't just show it to, try to think sort of strategically about and broadly who you might show that to, because it's always, I think, a really helpful experience to see what other people see through the lens of their experiences with you, or just their understanding of maybe the landscape of the type of thing you're applying for.
So I guess along those lines, who should you show it to? You mentioned your peers. I always have some people I love to share things with, even if they're not researching or doing things even remotely related to what I do, just to sort of see what someone outside of my area would think. But I also have a set of people that are kind of in the area that I'm interested in heading in, or that, have worked with me for some time, to get a feel for what they might think, in case when I'm writing falls into the hands of an expert. How might you get that feedback if you don't know anybody in that realm yet? One of the things that I've tried doing sometimes is sending it to someone I might know a little bit well, such as a professor, or maybe a colleague that I sort of know a little bit distantly, and asking them for their first impression. Sometimes that alleviates some of the burden of someone reading through your work very carefully and feeling the weight of needing to provide you meaningful comments that you might be able to leverage and improve upon. Then they can just give you this impression of saying like, well, I would love to know more about X, or hey, this particular thing you wrote about was really interesting and grabbed my attention. And that type of feedback is also very helpful.
I would suggest one place that you can start is to go to the Writing Center. I believe UCSD has one, and there's people there who their job is to provide you feedback on your writing. And then I also would suggest, if you work in a lab, talk to graduate students or people you look up to. If they're a grad student, they've written a personal statement, and professors. And even I used to have my mom read through it just for, does this make sense to someone who's not in research? And also read it out loud to yourself, not just in your head, out loud.
That's I second that. It's always fascinating how much differently the structure or the flow comes across when you read it out loud, and you will catch things so quickly and easily that you've read over 5 times. And then suddenly you'll be like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense, or like, oh, I need to, just little stylistic things, reading it out loud. I also want to second having someone like that's just a lay person that doesn't have any sort of maybe vested interest or knowledge of the field itself, but maybe knows you, and then they can kind of say like, yeah, this all, this from an impression perspective, or things that they feel maybe weren't clear. And then I also want to second the notion of sort of, certainly you should try and find some people that can give you some fine-grained and more detailed feedback. And if you can find somebody that will help you actually do a revision, that's even better. But even just like Laura said, getting it in front of people that can give you first impressions. And I think that leveraging your access to academics that have probably done this very recently is really worthwhile. And I know it can, sometimes be a little bit daunting to maybe ask your TA like, hey, would you maybe have time to just give this a once over and tell me your first impression, or whoever the case might be. But it never hurts to ask. And I think most people usually are, going to be pretty honest about whether they have the time or wherewithal to do that. So I definitely think it's good to get a variety of feedback. And then I don't think that there's anything also, one thing I always tell people to maybe do is there's a lot of opportunity to sort of, if you want to go sort of scrape the internet to find people that are in a field, or maybe are already at a school you're thinking about applying to. I've definitely had students that I was writing letters of recommendation for that have told me success stories of reaching out to a new member of a lab that they were interested in working at and saying, hey, just pinging you, I saw that I read this paper you published, I thought it was really cool, I love this lab, I want to go to this school. I know it's a long shot, or phrase it however, couch it however, but would you be willing to just give a quick read to my personal statement and let me know what you think? And I've had people that have had success with that. So I think it also just depends on how comfortable you are like putting yourself out there and maybe sort of like cold contacting somebody. But it can be a worthwhile strategy to really target somebody that's like where you want to be, and then get their feedback. So
it can also be useful, if they have time, the people who are writing your letters of recommendation, to share your personal statement with them, because that can really help them in writing your letter too.
Agreed. And if they're writing you a letter, they probably are vouching for things that would help you in the next step. So they might at least have some perception or ability to critique whether or not you've demonstrated your capabilities very well in your writing. Okay. So that is a little bit about the process. I'm going to go ahead and answer some questions on the chat real quick. I actually just sent a note to somebody at the Writing Center asking if non-UCSD students can use the services there. I actually don't know the answer to that. I think if they have an in-person meeting area, I don't see why not, but I don't have a very good answer for that right now, but I'll try to find out the answer to that. Is there a minimum or maximum number of people to ask to read your personal statement? Well, I would at least ask, one or two other people. How about that? But as far as max, that's a hard one because at some point it's hard to take a lot of different feedback. So, I would be a little bit strategic about who you send it to too. If you have like a ton of options, then you're in the best position possible and that you get to be selective and choose potentially. I would probably choose one person outside of the area so that just for clarity in general, and also one person inside the area to see whether or not you reach the depth that you wanted to and the description of yourself and maybe the things that you've learned.
I think that's also another good point to think about in terms of like both content and process is that you're going to get feedback. And if the feedback doesn't jive with who you feel you are as like if it doesn't actually feel like it's representing you, you should be you should be selective and thoughtful about what feedback you incorporate and why. I've definitely had some people sort of get in that between a rock and a hard place where they felt like, wow, okay, I got this professor to read my personal statement and they made these comments, but I feel like, should I change it because they know better than I do about this thing? Or, I think you just have to, I mean, I know it's maybe like the cheesiest way to put it, but like really do try to stay true to yourself, and you don't feel like you have to incorporate the feedback that you get from someone, but just think about why they might be making those comments, and then think about how you could maybe, work that into the content or flow of your statement.
Great. There's another question in the chat regarding if you're strapped for time, would you still recommend reaching out to one or two folks for feedback? I would say yes, especially since you sort of wrote that a strap for time, at least what you consider strap for time, is a month. Maybe I'm always writing by the seat of my pants, but I feel like a month is totally enough time to incorporate feedback. Again, maybe you're estimating that this person may take a week or so to get back to you, and then you might be having to integrate things very rapidly, and I understand that. I might try what I mentioned earlier, asking people for their, high level opinion or their first impression if you're worried that it might take them a while to get back to you. But even if I had only a couple days before a deadline, I've been known to send things to people and be like, can I get your high level impression on whether or not you like this idea or it makes sense? Or I've made this person out to be a strong candidate if I'm writing a letter of recommendation. Just because even if I'm strapped for time, I still want to know if it needs an edit. But then and maybe you don't have the time to incorporate all the changes, but there might be some key ones that you still have time to incorporate, and that might be something you would like to know still.
On a related note, I would suggest when you share your personal statement with others is that you let them know at what stage you're at. So for example, if it's like your first draft, no one else has seen it, and you send it to me, my feedback's going to be very different than if it's, oh, I want to send this out next week. Just so they can gauge their level of feedback for you.
Oh, and that might be another sort of related to both of those things, is if you are strapped for time and you are only going to show it to a couple people, is that you could totally tell them I want feedback on this specific thing, anything you can do to clue them into it's just like in design, for instance, making sure you let people know it's I don't want you to tell me feedback on the colors. I'm not to the point where I'm worrying about color choices. I just want to know if the layout makes sense. So same sort of thing, you can tell someone where you're at with it, maybe what, and also you can you can think about how you could leverage that particular person's knowledge and say, I would really like to get feedback on the way I present my research, for instance, or, so that way, they're focused on those, and you're getting the feedback that you maybe want or need the most out of that specific person.
Okay, well, the next question in the chat is actually a content related question, so maybe we'll transition here. I think when I am reading personal statements, I'm looking for something that indicates to me that somebody is ready for the next step, and why they are ready for that particular next step, or why they want to pursue that particular next step. And everything in the personal statement probably should be related to that, even if you have some wonderful things that you would like to share that are a part of your process. You'll want to make sure you relate that very clearly to whether or not you're ready for that next step, and why that particular next step, I think. The question in the chat is related to a gap year. And I think that's a great example of how you might think of that time in between graduating and when you're applying. So what did you do during that gap year? And a gap year is such a weird name for this time in between two points in sort of an academic regime. But ideally, during that gap year, you were learning, discovering things about the field that you're entering or yourself that are part of that process for you. And so if you are going to speak about a period of time in between graduating and applying for the next step, I would highly recommend you contextualizing it in, how that time contributed to your ability to be ready for that next step, and that particular next step. Whether it be that you spent a lot of time learning about the subject, or just grew a lot as an individual in specific ways, I would think that would be an excellent way of talking about a gap year. And we see so many applications with gap years in them, because now more and more it's the case that people spend time after undergraduate, other undergraduate education, getting more ready, and that's something that is very commonly seen in graduate school applications.
The advice someone gave to me when I was writing my personal statement to go to grad school was that you should be like telling a story, and that the next step should be grad school. Like it should be from reading the whole story, so to speak. The obvious next step when they get to the end would be, okay, you're ready to go to grad school now. That might be putting it simplistically.
I like that, actually, that especially the storytelling aspect. I certainly, in my experience in reading personal statements, both, even when I was a graduate student, I served on some of the admissions committee stuff and read a lot of personal statements, even that, back then. And yeah, the ones that tell a story where it's like, okay, this all checks out, and the next logical step is to join this program. And I just sort of also, in between those two things, is I'm a big proponent of non-traditional paths, mostly because I took a very non-traditional path to get to where I was or am today. And I would really encourage people to not shy away from not feeling like you have to connect this very specific set of dots. That's this very, expected path from point A to point grad school, or point A to point job, or whatever it might be. And to think again broadly about how those experiences, whatever they might be, have shaped who you are, what your passions are, what your why you feel you're ready, what you've learned, and thinking about how you want to structure that story of leveraging any of those sort of more non-traditional experiences, and bringing that into that narrative. Some of the best personal statements I've read don't really even sometimes talk about the things that you might expect, but the story they tell is very compelling. It's very personal. I feel like I actually am getting a glimpse into who that person is, why they care about this thing, and why it's really, you know, the thing they want to do next. So anything you can do to, you know, don't shy away from it is what I'm really trying to get at.
You know, maybe related to that, and to answer a follow-up question in the chat, if whether or not we see applications from people who have taken many years between their undergraduate and their next step. I'm not sure that we see a lot of people, but we certainly do see them. And even just anecdotally, the most recent graduate student I took to my own lab had a 6-year gap. And I pulled her application out of the pile, looked it over very carefully, and just decided that she was the absolute perfect match for my group. And so it's more about like all the things that Taylor and Emily are saying. She wrote a really wonderful narrative, but she also had really interesting letters, and she had, you know, really unique experiences in those 6 years. In fact, I just wrote her a letter nominating her for an award that is just particular for people who have more than 5 years of a gap in between their undergraduate and their graduate degree, which isn't a very large group of people. But you know, she's amazing. She got that award. There are opportunities for you know, people of your unique background and your, you know, your unique subset of experiences. And what we're trying to help you do here is convey what is unique about you and what makes you exceptional for this next step on paper, right? Which is very hard.
So there's another question about, if you don't necessarily have relevant research experience or job experience, how could you string together a cohesive story that shows that you're ready to embark on this next stage? And I think this is one of those instances where you're going to want to, this is a good opportunity to like get content on the page, like try writing the statement and then start thinking about what pieces, what do I have here? This is the type of question that it's really hard to answer in the abstract, but once you start getting content on a page and you start thinking through your experiences and you start thinking through your passions and you just try to start putting these things together, I think that makes it easier to start to see what path you might take to construct that narrative. And you might be surprised as you're writing that you'll go, oh, wait a second, I actually have done something that it may not be the exact thing I wish it was, but all of the skills, all of the responsibilities, all of the things that are part of that are totally applicable to this other thing. Or, oh, I don't have experience with that, but now that I'm writing about myself, I realize that this has always been a passion of mine and it has cropped up in different ways throughout my life. And I can start to tie those things together to maybe create a narrative that I may not have, you know, experience in this specific way that cross cuts in this specific way, but I do have experience throughout my entire life with things like this. And then, you know, I also think it's worth, this is another instance where it's worthwhile to maybe reach out to other people, show it to other people, talk to other people, because sometimes, again, they will be able to go, hey, I noticed you talked about this thing or these two things that may seem unrelated, but when you start to connect them together, you know, the building blocks, you know, it really is, it becomes one of the sum is greater than the parts type of thing. So like, I think get content on the page, start writing, don't be afraid, don't let not knowing what the story is stop you from starting to tell the story, because I think a lot of times what that story is will emerge. And real quick before I move on to pass on to another question, one of the most absolute best personal statements I ever read focused almost entirely on their passion for piano playing and all of the things that had taught them throughout their life, from when they were young all the way up through finishing their undergraduate, and the relationship that they had with a couple of different piano teachers and what it taught them about themselves and their creativity and their perseverance and all, you know, I mean, and they just told this wonderful story. And somehow, you know, at the end of it, you're like, yeah, this person's ready to go do HCI research. So it's like, you know, and I'm sure that they didn't necessarily have that just fully formed in their head when they sat down to write that personal statement. I'm sure it's something that emerged as they really started to think about and explore and reflect on their own experiences in life, and then you know, sometimes it just will come out of you like sweet, sweet music.
We have a lot of questions in the chat. So I think there's a string of them that are related to how personal can your personal statement be, in terms of, you know, what sort of anecdotes or visual imagery or experiences can you convey from your past. And I think there's no right answer to this other than probably anything goes, as long as it relates to how it prepared you for this next step and why this next step is perfect for you. And if you can do that, if it really is the inspiration for you having a passion for the field that you're entering or being absolutely ready for that next step, then I think it's an excellent thing to put down. You know, as Taylor mentioned with the piano playing, that may seem unrelated, but it's a unique part of you and a remarkable skill set you bring to the table, that, you know, would be wonderful to know about.
I would say that, like, I definitely agree with that. But another thing to add, like, I've seen some personal statements, first drafts, that are much more like a diary than, or a therapy session than I would suggest the final draft be. And one thing some students have asked me is if they have like a semester or quarter where they had particularly bad grades or had to take a leave of absence or some blip in their transcript that they want to talk about, that can be addressed separately in a letter to the dean in applying to grad school. It doesn't necessarily need to go in the personal statement.
Yeah, and in fact, some applications will even offer, you can include like an additional addendum to talk about hardships or other things that you want the committees to take into consideration in reviewing your application, or like Emily said, a letter to the dean. So I think I agree with Laura that if you feel it's important, if you feel that it's you know, something that you can work in, I really don't, I have seen everything from like pretty cold, sterile personal statements that are just sort of like very, you know, surface level, I would say, so to speak, and almost just like a chronological recounting of events, all the way through to like very personal stories about family or friends or things that inspired them to, you know, to pursue or to have that interest or whatever that might be. So I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule on whether you should or shouldn't include it. I think it's just more about like, how does this, why am I telling them this, and can I make it work within the construct of the narrative that you're crafting?
So there's a question, or maybe a couple, about what exactly should be the balance between personal things and research experience, or maybe job experience. And it's worth pointing out here that personal statements may or may not be different from a separate document that you get to provide regarding your previous experience that may have prepared you for the job. And if you are, or the grad school experience, and if you have the opportunity to split it up, then by all means take that extra, you know, several pages to write about your depth of understanding about the field and, you know, your previous experience versus, you know, what might be your specific interests and in how you feel you're very ready for this. If you don't get to, then it becomes a hard balance, right? to try to, you know, convey both. But ideally, there's some sort of split that most places might ask you separately, and so you can talk about each in sort of a focused manner. Regarding whether or not you should talk about job experience versus, you know, what could be academic or research lab experience that is a little bit more academic. There's no good answer to what the balance should be. It's mostly about probably what has prepared you the most and with the greatest depth, right? It is sometimes the case, I've spoken to my colleagues that they absolutely love to hear about people's successes in industry, in some cases they don't take, you know, well, in some cases they really appreciate it because it shows that that person has this perspective of being able to, you know, concisely convey their progress and make progress by deadlines, which is a hard thing that a lot of people haven't encountered, you know, sometimes before they finish their undergraduate career. And so those sorts of things can be really valuable to them. And I definitely think if it's something that you have industry experience, you should include it. If you have a lot of it that has given you a majority of your, will spawned a lot of your interests and given you a majority of your preparedness, and yeah, then the balance could be a little bit more toward industry than the academic end. But you can, you know, reel it in and say, you know, this is why I think my job experience has given me an excellent background for pursuing this graduate career or this next step in the job market.
And I think that's one of those things that also will become obvious through some revisions. You'll kind of, I think once you get it on the page and then you read it, you might just yourself have the instinct that like, I kind of got a little too far into that. And I feel like it's not really meshing with that core narrative of this research interest or whatever. I think quite a few of these questions, while all very good and understandable questions, I think for a lot of them, they will become easier. They'll become clearer and easier for you to answer as you are working on your personal statement as well. So, you know, it's like, it's hard sometimes to make these kinds of decisions for yourself, even in a vacuum. So I always tell students that are thinking about, you know, applying to grad school, it's like, okay, well, get a draft of your personal statement started ASAP, because like Emily was saying earlier, and we've been kind of reiterating, it's like, don't worry about that first draft. It's a like just get anything and everything in there that you feel like might be part of that story. And I love Emily's idea of the parking lot. You can always be moving things around and working on it. But a lot of this stuff, I really feel like starts to get clarified and become more obvious as you are working on your own personal statement. And it's also, along with what Laura was just saying, it is important to remember that the people that are going to be reading these, at least for now, until we just use AI to do all of this, they're just people. And you know, it's I think sometimes important to remind yourself that like another human being is going to be reading this, and sometimes there's going to be a different subjective, you know, experience of the reader of your personal statement as well. And so you know, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to, you know, please everybody or find that perfect balance or whatever, because that's going to vary, as well as find what you feel like is the best representation of yourself is I think should, at least what I think is a good sort of compass for making some of those a little bit harder, more nuanced decisions.
I would also suggest with your paragraph structure in general, make sure you have good intro sentences and concluding sentences for your paragraphs. Like I know I've read some personal statements that are very long, and like my friend sent me an 8-page personal statement to read. And so I mainly looked at like the first and last sentence of each paragraph to get the main points. And if people are pressed for time, they might not have time to read every single word. So make sure the key points stand out. They're not buried within a long paragraph.
Okay, so we have a number of questions regarding how specific maybe you should be. Maybe I didn't phrase that quite right, but if you are applying to a lot of schools, and good luck to you, that's rough. How tailored should your personal statement be to each school? Or, you know, there's another question on there regarding an interest in maybe kind of a broad discipline that has many sub-disciplines in it, that maybe you haven't quite made up your mind yet, even which sub-discipline you're particularly excited about, and you're not expected to. You'll figure that out more when you get there. But, you know, in the meantime, what should you be doing? And I think, again, you'll want to convey that you have a depth of interest and understanding without necessarily needing to adhere to one particular thing. So if you were to just take cognitive science, right? Cognitive science is a highly interdisciplinary program, and you could have a passion for this field and the type of research that is being done in this department without necessarily be wedded being wedded to a particular technique for doing research, but you might be kind of overall interested in a certain type of approach. There's bioinformatics, for example, in the chat, and what subdiscipline are you going to apply the bioinformatics to? Maybe you don't quite know that yet, but you know that you have a passion for rigorous quantitative characterization, and why, right? And so I think it's perfectly fine to have broad interests. How about that? And maybe there are things about the many places you're applying to that have common elements, and so you can actually recycle those aspects of your personal statement. I believe it is definitely a good idea to buckle down and show some depth for one or two things, and in particular when you're applying to cognitive science or a different department, to think critically about the faculty that are there and the research that they do, and why you might be an extremely good fit for at least 3 of the faculty there, and go ahead and say so in your personal statement. So maybe overall your personal statement has common elements to it, but it's gonna have to start narrowing in for each school to the faculty that are there and the research that is there, or if you're going for a job, the specific things that they're looking for in a candidate or in the field that they're doing research in. And otherwise it's hard for them to know how exactly to place you. And so you'll want to both, if you have broad interests, it's fine. You'll want to still show a depth of understanding and be as specific as possible.
And be sure to proofread that you have the name of the school correct. I've reviewed summer applications and they've written the wrong program name multiple times.
Yeah, not a good look. Speaking of which, I'll do two quick ones. How do you know what kind of applicants a PhD program is looking for? This is where I always tell students, like, lurk websites extensively, take notes, have a spreadsheet for every program you think you want to apply to. I've even, I encourage students oftentimes to, like, one of the good things that LinkedIn is really great for, in my opinion, maybe one of the only things that's good for, is to go look at what people from the programs you're thinking about applying to are doing now, right? So you can sort of like reverse engineer what their paths were, and think about, well, these are the types of, maybe careers or jobs or things that those people are doing, and they graduated from this program and they did this thing. And this is another place where I tell people, like, do a little bit of reaching out. It doesn't hurt to ping somebody and say, hey, I'm thinking about applying to this program. I see you went there. Would you have time for a 15-minute Zoom to just say hi and ask you a few questions about what the program is like? Or could I email you a few questions? Or I think people are often surprised to find out that, like, a lot of people are willing to take a few minutes to maybe help somebody because they remember, they know what it's like. They, and they want to help. Or you can even reach out to folks that are in those labs currently, doctoral students, postdocs, or, as Laura said, you can even think about who the professors are, and maybe even, I've certainly know of people that have reached out directly to a professor they want to work with, and even gone to the university and visited them before the applications are even due. So, I mean, there's a huge, spectrum of how in depth or how much contact you want to put into that. And then I do just want to note on the tailoring your personal statement it is something I would recommend doing whenever you can. But, like, don't let that become the thing where you're spinning and spending all of your time trying to, like, really meticulously tailor each and every one to each program, because I guess it depends on how many programs you're going to be applying to, but think about, still maintain some balance of perspective on how much time and energy you have to work on that. I thought there was one other one I saw that was, oh yeah, do you absolutely need personal stories in the statement? I think I answered this in the chat, but I want to reiterate that, to me, this is probably a really crucial thing to remember is that at the end of the day, when people are reading these, when folks on the committee or professors or whoever are reading them, you're kind of, in a sense, your main goal is to make yourself stand out as one of the most qualified or desirable applicants for that program, or somebody that they can get excited about or can really see fitting in with the culture of the program, or the research aims and goals. And if personal, if the actual personal aspects aren't coming through, then what do they really have to fall back on to understand, like, who you are, why you would be a good fit, why you're ready for grad school, why you're ready for that job, right? So I think it's absolutely crucial to include as much of who you are, even if that's told through, a different set of storytelling components than somebody else might. You might be telling it through very specific academic experiences you had, and someone else might be telling it through much more work-based or even just personal, like, life-based. So, but in any case, I think you really have to think about that your main goal is to make yourself stand out across a field of applicants, right? So.
And I guess sort of embedded in something you were saying is, so who are you trying to impress here? And so it super depends on the department, actually. And I've often urged departments to be more explicit about this, but in some departments, it is a committee, and that committee will see all the applications regardless of whether or not you are explicitly trying to work with someone outside of that committee. And in other departments, it is more of a match. So not everyone will see all the applications, but each faculty member that you listed you were interested in will get a chance to see your application and make a decision about you, and probably have to make a commitment commitment to you for the next 5 years at their desk there with your application. Well, you'll have an interview as well, potentially, but depending on the department, it works very differently. And so I don't know of any way for you to figure that out other than for the department to explicitly say so. I can tell you, at least for the 2 departments that I read applications for in neurosciences, it's more of a group of people reading for everyone, and they select the best candidates regardless of whether or not anybody is going to specifically speak up for you and decide you're a perfect match for them. In cognitive science, it's the opposite. That you list people that you're interested in working with, and the faculty member sees your application. That's not to say that that person gets all the weight in the world to pull your application through, but they have to kind of make a commitment right off the bat. The reason that is the case is because in cognitive science, everyone is assigned, for better or for worse, at least a temporary advisor. And you may switch advisors after joining, but someone has to be willing to watch out for you right off the bat, apply for fellowships for you right off the bat, et cetera. And so there's a lot of work that goes into even inviting you. And so, who you pick in terms of who you're interested in, it really matters for cognitive science here. That's, again, that's not to say that that person will even still see your application. Sometimes they're not accepting graduate students for whatever reason. It might not cross their desk. The best way, and it was sort of hidden, not hidden, but mentioned in what something either that Taylor or Emily were saying, the best way to make sure that someone knows you're applying to work with them is to contact them. And in cognitive science, that might have a little bit more weight. In neurosciences, even if someone contacts me saying they want to, they're interested in working with me potentially, all I can say is, wow, you seem great, and good luck on the interview process if you're invited. And if you come here, please contact me again, that sort of thing, because I have, potentially no way of looking into the application process in neurosciences as faculty and neurosciences. Okay, so it's my very long way of saying it's not clear, depending on the department, who's actually judging your application. But if you want to give yourself the best chances of ending up eventually with the lab that you're most excited in working with, or the people you're most excited in teaming up with, you can contact them early and hope to interview with them when you go visit.
Yeah, I would definitely, I think this is an important thing to reiterate, especially early on, is like people don't realize how A-okay it is to reach out to somebody, send them an email, shoot them a message. They're not going to think that you're some crazy stalker person just for reaching out to them and saying, hey, I think your research is amazing and I would love to come work in your lab. I feel like there's maybe sometime this, maybe preconceived notion that like that would be overstepping some bound, or, that would be a faux pas or frowned upon. But, some of the better success stories I know of are folks that preemptively reached out, showed interest, established even a tiny bit of initial rapport with them, because then later when they see your application kind of come across their desk and they're reading it, they're like, oh yeah, I remember I chatted with this person, or whatever the case may be. So again, anything that's going to help, bubble you to the top, so to speak, of the candidates, I think is a good thing.
Adding to what Taylor just said, one silver lining, maybe you could think of it this way, of the pandemic is that it's a lot more normal to have like video meetings.
Mhm.
And so if you reach out to someone, you could possibly have even a 10-15 minute chat with them if they can find the time. And it's very normal to have like a Zoom meeting with them. And then another thing, I've talked to students who are very scared to reach out, and I was also very scared, and I still get intimidated emailing professors even as a graduate student. But reaching out to professors, you'll be no worse off. The worst thing that'll happen is that they won't reply.
And take it from me, if we don't reply, it doesn't mean we don't like you or that we don't want to. It just means that that was the 112th email to come in our inbox that day and we maybe accidentally missed it or something like that. So
Yep.
don't always take it immediately as a bad sign if they don't reply. They might even later go like, oh yeah, I read your email. Like, oh, thanks for replying.
That's happened to me, unfortunately. That someone during the interview process came through and I was like, I recognize this name. And I went back and I was like, oh, that's right. That was an extremely interesting person that I failed to respond to. Hopefully it's not crushing. But it does, but it did occur to me when I saw their name during the interview that I had been really excited about them previously. What I will also say, because there's a question in there about how specific you might be or generic. I Again, there's probably no right answer here. It's going to end up being an interesting balance of showing that you can fit, but maybe not necessarily pigeonholing yourself into a specific category if you're not of research, if your interests aren't quite that narrow. I can just tell you anecdotally to help relieve some of the pressure, maybe, that I have a grad student who I absolutely adore in my group, who applied to cognitive science, and her application was not in my pile because she didn't even say she was interested in working with me. And then when you read her personal statement, she doesn't say anything in there either about wanting to do research like mine. However, I read her background and her sort of broader interests, and I knew she was perfect for our group. So I recruited her. I spent a lot of time recruiting her, actually, and she's doing very well. So it all is not lost if you completely ignored somebody who thinks you're the bee's knees. It can work out sometimes too.
That personally happened to me with UCSD.
Sorry, I think we're all trying to read the chat. So there's a question about reaching out to the PI or the PhD students. Both are probably really valuable. I think, getting involved in the research culture, which includes the PhD students, and sort of understanding what graduate school is like there, is going to be very valuable for you too. not sure that it will. So we're starting to talk a little bit more about what you can leverage for the graduate school process versus what you want to do in your personal statement. But I suppose it could give you insight into how people are talking about research there, which sometimes is really clarifying for what you end up writing in the personal statement. Because while you think, for example, that you're interested in memory or whatever, and you realize that other people are sort of describing memory a little differently in the research that they're doing. You might realize like, yes, I am sort of interested in the subdivision of memory, and you can use that to convey your more specific interests if you aren't used to talking in that language previously.
I would also add to the question of reaching out to professors versus graduate students. I know this is kind of a tangent, but one thing I always suggest to do is to check that PI's website if they have it. And very often, at least when I was applying to graduate school, I would see they'd have a thing like, if you're interested in applying to grad school, email this person. Like, so they would tell you who to contact about if they're taking graduate students. Essentially, just do your homework.
Yeah, I think that is also, I want to second that and even promote it even more. Is I think maybe a lot of people underestimate just how much, depending on how much time and energy you have, again, how much you can really dig into the websites, publications, the back, like that. You can get a pretty darn good sense of who the people in a lab or a department are, and what kind of work they're doing, and where they're publishing. And like I said, you can even see where some of the folks that come out of that lab, where they end up. And I mean, you can get a pretty clear sense of quite a few of these things, and anything you can leverage in how you craft your statement, or in just being able to better articulate for yourself, is this a good fit for me? Is this somewhere, can I see myself going and doing this work and working with these people? And so I think it's like really crucially important to have that in mind, the do your homework thing. That's why I say, like, I don't even want to go back and look at the spreadsheet I had when I was applying to grad school. I think I applied to 12 schools. Yeah, I was overly ambitious. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But I mean, I had that spreadsheet. I don't even know how many columns and rows it ended up being, and color coded this and that. And oh boy, I wouldn't. I mean, it was a great tool. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't do your homework, but maybe just, within reason.
So there's a question about, I'll generalize it actually. There's a question in the chat about what to do when you have things that might be perceived potentially negatively in your application. The one that's in the chat is having over a year of withdrawal from your undergraduate career. Another common one that comes up is having a low GPA. And another one might be, having, let's just leave it at low GPA. So when these things happen, right, you'll just want to, you have something that you feel you need to contextualize for the people reviewing your application. You'll need to address it, right? You'll probably need to address it head on, and hopefully leverage it for explaining exactly why you're extremely prepared for this opportunity, and why this opportunity in particular, right? I keep saying that. So in the case of needing to withdraw for a year, right? Whether it belongs here or in another place, does it demonstrate an ability, potentially a lot of grit, or an ability to manage a lot of tasks, or potentially resilience, right? To, if you had a gap, assuming it, withdrawal, assuming it means you came back, which is amazing. It's very hard, actually. And so, what can you say about this? In the case of the low GPA, ideally, you have a bit of an arc, right? Where, maybe you struggle with some things. but you know, you started to get a little bit better with them, and you can even describe it that way. These things show perseverance, usually. And so, you know, without relying on someone to look carefully for it, like, they have some low grades here and it gets higher, or they withdrew and then they came back and with vengeance, you know, like, what do you want to say about that time, or you know, that experience, and what would you like us to take away from that? And I think that's how you might want to think about including that. But if it's something that's going to be visually obvious that you think you need to address, I would probably address it head on.
I would also say, you know, don't let that stop you from applying either. You know, if you did have a bad year, but then you came back, or if you did have a dip in your GPA, but then it came, you know, or whatever the case might be, anything that you think is like a blemish, don't let that stop you from applying. You know, I think it's important to recognize and realize that yes, there, you know, at a baseline, we do tend to look, you know, we're going to look at those markers, right? But I can say definitely we've had cases, you know, ranging over the entire time I've been in academia, that those things can be offset by a particularly, you know, compelling personal statement, or it's very obvious that, like, okay, this part of their academic career was a little bumpy, but they talked a little bit about that and they clearly learned something from it. And, you know, so it's not a, you know, it's not a total strike against you of like, absolutely not, you know, but I think it is important that if it is something that you feel like is going to stand out, as Laura said, to address it.
Okay, well, if there are any remaining questions, please go ahead and ask them. Otherwise,
are you going to send a recording out, Laura? Are you going to send
yeah,
or have Ton send a follow-up email maybe?
usually that's what we do.
Okay.
This will show up as some sort of link, and then people will be able to access it that way.
Cool.
Yeah, that should be the route this time too.
Oh, and Emily's guide. Yeah, we'll make a note can we include that? Yeah.
Sounds good.
It's been updated since the guide last year.
Oh, updated and revised and expanded edition.
Wonderful. Then we'll have that sent out. It'll come from the undergraduate coordinator. So however you found out about this previously, whether it be on Facebook or through a, you know, diversity website or through an email listserv, we'll find a way to get it out. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Peace.